Roswell, Alien Interview, Chapter 6, My Education Begins. Matilda O'Donnell McElroy personal note. By the 15th day after rescuing Errol from the crash site, I was able to communicate fluidly and effortlessly with her in English. She had absorbed so much more written material by this time that her academic education far exceeded my own. Although I graduated from high school in Los Angeles in 1940 and attended college for 4 years of pre-medical and nursing training, the variety of my own reading had been fairly limited. I had not studied most of the subjects to which Errol had now been exposed, especially considering her acute understanding, very intense study habits, and a nearly photographic memory. She was able to recall long passages from books she read. She was especially fond of sections of her favorite stories from classic literature like The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, Tales from Gulliver's Travels, and Peter Pan, and The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. By this time Errol had become the teacher and I was the student. I was about to learn what men of Earth don't know and have no way of knowing. The throng of scientists and agents who observed us through the one-way glass of our interview room, whom Errol and I now referred to as the gallery, were growing increasingly impatient to ask her questions. But Errol continued to refuse to allow any questions to be asked of her by anyone other than myself, even vicariously through me as an interpreter or in writing. On the afternoon of the 16th day, Errol and I sat next to each other as she read. She closed the last page of a book she was reading and placed it aside. I was about to hand her the next book from a large pile waiting to be read, when she turned and said, or thought to me, "I'm ready to speak now." At first I was a little confused by the remark. I gestured for her to continue, and she began to teach me my first lesson. Official transcript of interview, top secret. Official transcript of the U.S. Army Air Force, Roswell Army Airfield, 59th Bomb Group. Subject, Alien Interview, July 24th, 1947. First session. "What would you like to say, Errol?" I asked. "I have been part of a domain expeditionary force in this sector of space for several thousand years. However, I have not personally had intimate contact with beings on Earth since 5965 BCE. It is not my primary function to interact with inhabitants of planets within the domain. I am an officer, pilot, and engineer, with many duties to perform. Nonetheless, although I'm fluent in 347 other languages within the domain, I have not been exposed to your English language. The last Earth language with which I was conversant was the Sanskrit language of the Vedic hymns. At that time I was a member of a mission sent to investigate the loss of a domain base located in the Himalaya Mountains. An entire battalion of officers, pilots, communications, and administrative personnel disappeared and the base destroyed. Several million years ago, I was trained and served as an investigation, data evaluation, and program development officer for the domain. Because I was experienced in that technology, I was sent to Earth as part of a search team. One of my duties involved interrogation of the human population that inhabited the adjoining area at that time. Many of the people in that region reported sighting Vimanas, or spacecraft, in the area. Following the logical extension of evidence, testimony, observation, as well as the absence of certain evidence, I led my team to the discovery that there were still Old Empire ships and well-hidden Old Empire installations in this solar system of which we had been completely unaware. You and I were unable to communicate in your language because I personally have not been exposed to your language. However, now that I have scanned the books and the material you provided me, this data has been relayed to our space station in this region and processed by our communications officer through our computers. It has been translated into my own language and relayed back to me in a context that I can think with. I have also received additional information from the files stored in our computers about the English language and domain records concerning Earth civilization. Now I'm prepared to give you certain information that I feel will be of great value to you. I will tell you the truth. Although truth is relative to all other truth, I wish to share with you, as honestly and accurately as possible, truth as I see it, within the boundaries of my integrity to myself, to my race, and without violating my obligations to the organization I serve and have sworn to uphold and protect. Okay, I thought. Will you answer questions from the gallery now? No, I will not answer questions. I will provide information to you that I think will be beneficial to the well-being of the immortal spiritual beings who comprise humanity, and that will foster the survival of all the myriad life forms and the environment of Earth, as it is a part of my mission to ensure the preservation of Earth. Personally, it is my conviction that all sentient beings are immortal spiritual beings. This includes human beings. For the sake of accuracy and simplicity, I will use a made-up word, is-be, because the primary nature of an immortal being is that we live in a timeless state of is, and the only reason for their existence is that they decide to be. No matter how lowly their station in a society, every is-be deserves the respect and treatment that I myself would like to receive from others. Each person on earth continues to be an is-be, whether they are aware of the fact or not. Matilda O'Donnell McElroy, personal note. I will never forget this conversation. Her tone was very matter-of-fact and emotionless. However, for the first time I sensed the presence of a warm and real personality in Errol. Her reference to immortal spiritual beings struck me like a flash of light in a dark room. I had never before considered that a human being could be an immortal being. I thought that status or power was reserved solely for the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. And because I am a devout Catholic and subject to the word of the Lord Jesus and the Holy Father, I have never thought of a woman as an immortal spiritual being either, not even the Holy Mother Mary. Yet when Errol thought that thought, I became vividly aware for the first time that she personally was an immortal spiritual being, and so are we all. Errol said that she sensed that I was confused about the idea. She said she would demonstrate to me that I am also an immortal spiritual being. She said, "Be above your body." Immediately I realized that I was outside of my body, looking down from the ceiling at the top of my body's head. I was also able to see the room around me, including Errol's body, sitting in the chair next to my own body. After a moment I realized the simple but shocking reality that I am not a body. In that moment a black veil lifted, and for the first time in my life, and for a very long time into the past, I realized that I am not my soul, but that I am me, a spiritual being. This was an unexplainable epiphany, but one that fills me with joy and relief I cannot recall having experienced ever before. As for the immortal part, I do not understand her meaning, as I have always been taught that I am not immortal, a spirit perhaps, but certainly not immortal. After a moment, I'm not sure how long, Errol asked me if I had a better understanding of the idea. Suddenly, I was back inside my body again and said out loud, "Yes, I see what you mean." I was so taken aback by the experience that I had to get up from my chair and walk around the room for a few minutes. I made an excuse that I needed to get a drink of water and go to the restroom, which I did. In the restroom, I looked at myself in the mirror. I used the toilet, refreshed my makeup, and straightened my uniform. After 10 or 15 minutes, I felt more normal again and returned to the interview room. After that, I felt as though I was no longer an interpreter for Errol. I felt as though I was a kindred spirit. I felt like I was safe at home with a trusted friend or a family member, as close as any I had ever had. Errol sensed and understood my confusion about the concept of personal immortality. She began her first lesson with me by explaining this to me. Official transcript of interview continued. Errol told me her reasons for coming to Earth and for being in the area of the 509th Bomber Squadron. She was sent by her superior officers to investigate the explosions of nuclear weapons, which have been tested in New Mexico. Her superiors ordered her to gather information from the atmosphere that could be used to determine the extent of radiation and potential harm this might cause to the environment. During her mission, the spacecraft was struck by a lightning, which caused her to lose control and crash. The spacecraft is operated by ISBs, who use doll bodies in much the same way that an actor wears a mask and costume. It is like a mechanical tool through which to operate in the physical world. She, as well as all the other ISBs of the officer class and their superiors, inhabit these doll bodies when they are on duty in space. When they are not on duty, they leave the body and operate, think, communicate, travel, and exist without the use of a body. The bodies are constructed of synthetic materials, including a very sensitive electrical nervous system, to which each ISB adjusts themselves or tune in to an electronic wavelength that is matched uniquely to the wavelength or frequency emitted by each ISB. Each ISB is capable of creating a unique wave frequency which identifies them much like a radio signal frequency. This serves in part as identification like a fingerprint. The doll body acts like a radio receiver for the ISB. No two frequencies or doll bodies are exactly the same. The bodies of each ISB crew member are likewise tuned into and connected to a nervous system built into the spacecraft. The spacecraft is built in much the same way as the doll body. It is adjusted specifically to the frequency of each ISB crew member. Therefore, the craft can be operated by the thoughts or energy emitted by the ISB. It is really a very simple direct control system, so there are no complicated controls or navigation equipment on board the spacecraft. They operate as an extension of the ISB. When the lightning bolt struck the spacecraft, this caused a short circuit and consequently disconnected them from the control of the ship momentarily, which resulted in the crash. Errol was and still is an officer, pilot, and engineer in an expeditionary force which is part of a space opera civilization which refers to itself as the Domain. This civilization controls the vast number of galaxies, stars, planets, moons, and asteroids throughout an area of space that is approximately 1/4 of the entire physical universe. The continuing mission of her organization is to secure, control, and expand the territory and resources of the Domain. Errol pointed out that their own activities were very similar in many ways to the European explorers who discovered and claimed the New World for the Holy Father, the Pope, and for the kings of Spain, Portugal, and later Holland, England, France, and so forth. Europe benefited from the property acquired from the native inhabitants. However, the native inhabitants were never consulted with or asked for their permission to become a part of the domain of the European nations, and the soldiers and priests they sent to acquire territory and wealth in order to advance their interests. Errol said she read in a history book that the Spanish king regretted the brutal treatment of the native inhabitants by his soldiers. He feared retribution from the gods he worshipped, as described in the various testaments of the Bible. He asked the Pope to prepare a statement called the Requirement, which was supposed to be read to each of the newly encountered native inhabitants. The king hoped that the statement, whether it was accepted or rejected by the natives, would absolve the king of all responsibility for the resulting slaughter and enslavement of these people. He used this statement as justification to confiscate their lands and possessions by his soldiers and the Pope's priests. Apparently, the Pope, personally, did not have any feelings of guilt or responsibility in the matter. Errol thought that such actions were those of a coward, and that it is no surprise that the territory of Spain was diminished so quickly. Only a few years later the king was dead, and his empire had been assimilated by other nations. Errol said that this sort of behavior does not occur in the Domain. Their leaders assume full responsibility for the actions of the Domain and would not denigrate themselves in this fashion. Nor do they fear any gods or have any regret for their actions. This idea reinforces my earlier suggestion that Errol and her people are probably atheists. In the case of the acquisition of Earth by the Domain, the rulers of the Domain have chosen not to openly reveal this intention to their native inhabitants of Earth until a later time when it may or may not suit their interest to reveal themselves. For the present time, it is not strategically necessary to make the presence of the Domain Expeditionary Force known to mankind. In fact, until now, it has been very aggressively hidden for reasons that will be revealed later. The asteroid belt near Earth is very small, but important location for the Domain in this part of space. Actually, some of the objects in our solar system are very valuable for their use as low-gravity space stations. They are interested primarily in the low-gravity satellites in this solar system, which consists mainly of the side of the Moon facing away from Earth and the asteroid belt, which is a planet that was destroyed billions of years ago, and to a lesser degree Mars and Venus. Dome structures synthesized from gypsum or underground bases covered by electromagnetic force fields are easily constructed to house the Domain forces. Once an area of space is acquired by the Domain and becomes a part of the territory under its control, it is treated as the property of the Domain. The space station near the planet Earth is important only because it lay along a path of the domain expansion route toward the center of the Milky Way galaxy and beyond. Of course, everyone in the domain is aware of this, except for the people of Earth. She was able to recall long passages from books she read. She was especially fond of sections of her favorite stories from classic literature like The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, Tales from Gulliver's Travels, and Peter Pan, and The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. By this time Errol had become the teacher and I was the student. I was about to learn what men of Earth don't know and have no way of needed my own. Although I graduated from high school in Los Angeles in 1940 and attended college for 4 years of pre-medical and nursing training, the variety of my own reading had been fairly limited. I had not studied most of the subjects to which Errol had now been exposed, especially considering her acute understanding, very intense study habits, and a nearly photographic memory. Roswell, Alien Interview, Chapter 6, My Education Begins. Matilda O'Donnell McElroy personal note. By the 15th day after rescuing Errol from the crash site, I was able to communicate fluidly and effortlessly with her in English. She had absorbed so much more written material by this time that her academic education far exceeded knowing. The throng of scientists and agents who observed us through the one-way glass of our interview room, whom Errol and I now referred to as the gallery, were growing increasingly impatient to ask her questions. But Errol continued to refuse to allow any questions to be asked of her by anyone other than myself, even vicariously through me as an interpreter or in writing. On the afternoon of the 16th day, Errol and I sat next to each other as she read. She closed the last page of a book she was reading and placed it aside. I was about to hand her the next book from a large pile waiting to be read, when she turned and said, or thought to me, "I'm ready to speak now." At first I was a little confused by the